The First World War, often called the Great War, was a conflict unlike any before it. From 1914 to 1918, Europe was engulfed in a war that claimed millions of lives and redrew the map of the world. The world in 1914 was on the brink of change. New technologies and old rivalries combined into a deadly cocktail. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, a chain of events was set in motion that would plunge Europe into darkness. What began as a localized conflict quickly escalated into a global war. The Great War was a total war, one that affected not just soldiers on the battlefield, but civilians on the home front. New technologies like machine guns, tanks and airplanes made warfare deadlier than ever before, but it was the brutal reality of trench warfare that became synonymous with the horrors of World War I. By understanding the true cost of this conflict, we can hopefully learn from the mistakes of the past and strive for a more peaceful future. The trenches of the Western Front were a terrifying reality for the millions of soldiers who fought in World War I. Stretching for hundreds of miles, these muddy ditches became a horrifying symbol of the war's brutality and stalemate. Life in the trenches was a constant struggle for survival against not only the enemy, but also the elements and disease. Soldiers on both sides faced unimaginable conditions. The trenches were often flooded, infested with rats, and filled with the stench of death. Disease was rampant, and the lack of sanitation only made matters worse. Trench foot, a painful and debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp and unsanitary conditions, was a constant threat. The constant fear of enemy attack added to the psychological strain. Soldiers lived with the knowledge that at any moment they could be ordered over the top to face a hail of machine gun fire and artillery bombardment. The human cost of this kind of warfare was staggering. World War I marked a terrifying turning point in warfare with the introduction of chemical weapons on a massive scale. These deadly agents, used primarily in the trenches of the Western Front, added a new dimension of horror to an already brutal conflict. The first major use of chemical weapons came in 1915 when German forces released chlorine gas against French and Algerian troops during the Second Battle of Ypres. The effects were devastating. The heavy gas, greenish-yellow in colour, sank into the trenches, causing choking, burning sensations in the lungs and a slow, agonizing death. The psychological impact of gas attacks was profound, leaving many survivors with lasting trauma. Over the course of the war, various types of chemical weapons were deployed, each more deadly than the last. Mustard gas, first used in 1917, caused severe blistering of the skin, eyes and respiratory tract. The use of chemical weapons was a dark chapter in the history of warfare. It not only caused unimaginable suffering and death on the battlefield, but also left a legacy of environmental damage and long-term health problems for survivors. The Battle of Verdun, which raged for 10 grueling months in 1916, stands as one of the longest and most costly battles in human history. It epitomized the brutal nature of trench warfare and the devastating strategy of attrition employed during World War I. The battle, fought between German and French forces, became a symbol of national pride and determination for both sides, but it came at an unimaginable human cost. The German offensive at Verdun aimed to bleed France white by forcing them into a battle of attrition that they could not win. The French, determined to hold their ground, poured men and resources into the defense of the fortress city, which held immense strategic and symbolic value. The battle raged for months, with both sides suffering horrific casualties. By the time the battle ended in December 1916, an estimated 700,000 men had been killed or wounded. Verdun became a symbol of French resilience, but it also served as a stark reminder of the devastating human cost of the war. As if the horrors of World War I were not enough, a deadly pandemic swept across the globe. The Spanish flu infected an estimated 500 million people worldwide and killed 50 to 100 million. The pandemic coincided with the final years of World War I, devastating warring nations and the world. The war's troop movements and unsanitary conditions bred the virus. Soldiers, weakened by war, were particularly susceptible. The Spanish flu spread rapidly through trenches, camps and cities. Symptoms included high fever, chills, muscle aches and pneumonia. Medical facilities struggled to cope with the pandemic. Entire battalions were incapacitated, hampering the war effort. The pandemic highlighted the interconnectedness of the world. World War I brought about a new kind of casualty, one not always visible but no less devastating. Shell shock described the psychological trauma suffered by soldiers enduring trench warfare. It manifested in physical symptoms like tremors and paralysis and mental anguish. Constant bombardment and the sight of death took a heavy toll on soldiers' mental well-being. Many veterans struggled to readjust to civilian life, haunted by their experiences. The stigma surrounding mental illness prevented many from seeking help. The legacy of shell shock, later known as PTSD, extended far beyond World War I. The First World War, often romanticized as the war to end all wars, ended on November 11, 1918. The armistice brought an end to the fighting, but the world had been irrevocably changed. The conflict had left an enduring legacy, shaping the political, social and economic landscape of the 20th century and beyond. The war resulted in an estimated 40 million casualties, including both military personnel and civilians. Entire generations were decimated, leaving behind a void that would be felt for decades to come. The war also led to the collapse of empires, the redrawing of national boundaries and the rise of new ideologies, including communism and fascism. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war, but sowed the seeds of future conflict. The treaty, which placed the blame for the war squarely on Germany and imposed harsh reparations, created resentment and instability in Europe. The economic consequences of the war were far-reaching, leading to hyperinflation, unemployment and social unrest. The war also gave rise to a generation of writers and artists who sought to make sense of the conflict's horrors and its impact on humanity.